Good evening, everyone. I'm Jean Shaheen. I'm director at the Institute of Politics. We're delighted you're here to join us tonight for what is going to be a fabulous forum here at the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. On January 3rd of this year, lobbyist Jack Abramoff pled guilty to three felony counts in a federal investigation of corruption in the Congress. This is a scandal that the New York Times has called potentially one of the most explosive in congressional history. Abramoff's influence peddling is suspected to reach all levels of power in Washington and in the Congress. Tom DeLay, the Texas Republican majority leader, has already stepped down in part because of his ties to Abramoff. And tonight's panel is going to explore what's going on in Washington, the questions surrounding this scandal, and the broader state of congressional ethics. We have a very knowledgeable and distinguished panel this evening. Our first guest is a resident scholar for the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research in Washington. He frequently appears on television as an election analyst and political commentator, and his articles have been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, among many others. Not surprisingly, the National Journal has called him an icon of the press. That's very impressive. A commentator who is called on to deliver the final word. His latest book is The Broken Branch: How Congress is Failing America and How to Get It Back on Track. Please welcome Norm Ornstein. Our next panelist was the national editor at the Boston Globe from 2001 to 2005. He's reported for the Washington Post, Knight Ridder, the Boston Globe, among others. He covered Washington for over a decade, including the Republican Revolution in 1994. And in 1984, he shared the Pulitzer Prize for a series he wrote on institutional racism in Boston, and he was only 28 at the time. Most importantly, from our perspective, he's going to be a fellow at the Institute of Politics this semester, where he will be examining Black and Latino coalition politics in his study group. Join me in welcoming Ken Cooper. In the 1980s, our next panelist became the first woman pollster in a presidential campaign, and she also is the person who developed the concept of the gender gap. For the last 20 years, she's been at CBS News, where she covered 5 presidential elections, 10 party conventions, 18 presidential and vice presidential debates, and 5 midterm elections. Makes me tired just listening to that. She stepped down from her position at CBS News, and their loss is our gain because she is also going to be a fellow here at the Institute of Politics this semester. We're fortunate to have her. She's going to be looking at the midterm elections this year. Please welcome Dottie Lynch. Our final panelist this evening is the Alfred North Whitehead Professor of Political Philosophy at Harvard. He's a founding director of the Edmund Safra Foundation Center for Ethics here at Harvard. His research has focused on ethical issues in politics, and he's the author of a number of books on the topic, including Political Ethics and Public Office, and Ethics in Congress, From Individual to Institutional Corruption. He served as a consultant for any number of groups, including the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Ethics. Please welcome Dennis Thompson. Now, what's happening in Washington? Is this business as usual? Is the Abramoff scandal different from other scandals, political scandals? What do you think, Norm?
Well, let me start, Gene. I just came down, and I just wanted to bring you up to date on the latest news. I got just before we got here. The CIA announced they had just learned that apparently there was a big football game this past Sunday in Detroit. FBI is still checking on it. So. A lot of suspicious phone traffic from Seattle, apparently.
Chatter.
This is not, I think, business as usual. And I write a weekly column for a newspaper on Capitol Hill called Roll Call. And about 6 months ago, I wrote that we hadn't seen anything like this in 100 years. And a lot of people poo-pooed it. But I really think you have to go back to the Gilded Age because it was a combination of an arrogance of power, a level of venality that I've been there 36 years and I just haven't seen it quite like this. And an attempt to build a whole system, which is what we had in the Gilded Age, which was a term coined by Mark Twain in a novel in the 1870s, where you had moneyed interests, the robber barons back then, throwing a lot of money around Washington to political figures who did their bidding, making sure that they had all kinds of people larded in the places that mattered inside government and got their people in that place. And some of the money then got channeled back to campaigns so that they could perpetuate themselves in power. And the K Street Project, as it played out, and Abramoff seized on this opportunity, and it began in some ways in a perfectly reasonable way when the Republicans took office in 1994. Having been out for 40 years, the establishment in the city was completely dominated by Democrats. You didn't have to threaten people to get Democrats into positions as lobbyists or heading up trade associations or running Washington offices, because that's where the access was and that's where the power was. And wanting to have some of your own people in place was perfectly reasonable, but it got distorted pretty quickly into something else, something where the powers of government, of the state, were used to threaten and shake down interest to make sure they could get their people in place. And as you played it through, it was specific people in specific jobs who then were basically told, hey, you're going from making 50 grand as a staffer on the Hill to making 180 grand as a lobbyist. Now when we come to you, you're going to give $25,000 of your own money back into the campaign coffers because that's almost the price of admission. And you throw Abramoff into this mix and others who also recognize, by the way, that we now have a government that has so much power and there's so much money involved that interest groups could see that if you made a little investment, you could get contracts worth hundreds of millions or billions, and it didn't take very much money to do that. And Abramoff said, well, I should get 10% of this. So he raised the fees, brought even more money into it, and then we got just a combination that was destined to fail, but it took much longer to fail than it should have. And it's going to reverberate, I think, for a long time.
So everybody agree this is the worst?
Yeah, I would agree that just a couple of caveats. First, several other scandals are often mentioned in the same breath. The Keating Five, the House Bank scandal, which Ken actually covered, and so he knows something about it. He's really up to date. And Abscam. Those in our time are sometimes cited as similar. I think they all pale in comparison for some of the reasons Norm has already suggested. For one thing, all of them were, the Abscam and the Keating Five were not coordinated, organized operations. They were individuals, actually. Even the Keating Five only came together for that one meeting and wished they never had it. The House Bank scandal, in my view, and I'll defer to Ken because he was involved in it.
Careful.
Maybe you should clarify that.
Writing about it.
Should not have been called a scandal. It was mismanagement and carelessness more than anything that we would recognize as corruption. So the scope of this, the number of people, it was organized, the way it was organized, it reached into the executive branch, high-level people in the Interior Department and the OMB. It had a kind of structure where you can find pieces of it in earlier scandals, but nothing like this. I'm not even sure the Gilded Age. So having said that, something I hope we'll come back to, I am somewhat concerned that we focus too much on Abramoff because It's bribery and a pretty clear case of corruption. And one of the reasons that I'm worried about focusing on it is so unprecedented. And there are other forms of institutional corruption going on in Washington that are also very serious. And if you think everything has to look like the Abramoff scandal or it's not bad, you're going to miss some other things going on.
Well, the first thing I would say is that, Norm, your discourse there at the top is a good example why reporters like myself in Washington call you early and often and hear you out. I would add a caveat that the Abramoff scandal hasn't completely played out in the courts. And, how you measure these things, one way is how many convictions, and convictions of whom. And looking back over it, Abscam, there were actually 5 members of Congress, all Democrats, who were convicted and sentenced to prison. There were 4 convictions in the House bank scandal of, in my mind, relatively lesser crimes and bribery. So I think I'm waiting to see that play out. That said, and I've been looking at Washington from afar here in Boston for the last 5 years, I am struck by some of the more institutional changes that are happening. It seems like the revolving door between government and lobbying firms is spinning faster. I read where the number of lobbyists, or raw absolute number of lobbyists in Washington, has gone up a lot since the year 2000. The big increase in earmarked pork barrel projects in legislation by a factor of 10 or something like that over a decade. And these are very significant changes in the order of things in Washington and the level and the degree of things that have gone on before, but it's a tremendous leap forward.
Yeah, I agree, and I think the Abramoff issue, Abramoff in and of himself and these associated things are mainly just one that we have documentation on, namely emails, where he couldn't control himself in his emails, and therefore we've got all the information. But the fact that this was going on was kind of known, and I blame the press as well as the rest of the players in the institution for not doing something earlier. Now we have the emails on Abramoff. Now we see exactly how it worked. But those of us who were watching basically knew this type of thing was going on. It was harder to prove without the emails. But I think that the system that was created, that this is a part of, is something that is been allowed to happen in many ways. I was thinking, not to make Norm feel too good, but I remember leaving here at the end of 2004 doing a panel and running into Norm, who was going to speak to the new members of Congress, and he was in the lobby of the Charles Hotel just beside himself about Tom DeLay and the kinds of things that DeLay was up to, and the fact that the Washington Post, among other news organizations, wasn't looking into this, wasn't holding him accountable. And in the days that this has now come to light, I've been thinking, this is, Norm was so right. And he was one of the few people who was running around hysterical about this. The rest of us kind of said, this is awful, we should do something about it, and then went off to the next thing. But I think that's the real worry, that Abramoff has shown us what was going on, but there's a lot more to it.
Well, so the Constitution guarantees the right to lobby. Is this just a function of lobbyists out of control? Is it a result of the system not working the way it should? What's behind it?
It's we have to be a little careful here as well. A lot of members of Congress want to frame this as lobbyists gone wild, and that's not a video you want to see or purchase. That they're just victims here, and the lobbyists are the perpetrators. And that's not the case. Actually, the members of Congress are as much the victimizers as the victims. And it's basically because we're awash in money. And, of course, partly we have this unusual, maybe unprecedented period of extremely close margins in Congress and sharp, bitter confrontation. So the need to raise money to keep a majority or to raise money to move into a majority has grown enormously. And now one of the worst elements of this is these leadership PACs. The price of admission to get to be a subcommittee chair, a committee chair, or a party leader is you've got to show that you can raise hundreds of thousands of dollars at least for the team, not for yourself. And what they're doing is shaking down lobbyists to do this. The House Appropriations Committee, now they have term limits for chairs, had an opening for the chairmanship at the beginning of this last Congress. There were 3 candidates, 3 good veteran members of Congress. The appropriators tend to be the best legislators. And it was clear it was a competition where how good they were as legislators, how strong they were as leaders, what they believed was less significant than whether they could go out and raise the money. And they did some things that embarrassed themselves. The chair of the committee now is Jerry Lewis, is already getting himself into some trouble because of some of the relationships he's developed and the money that he's raised. And that's a part of it. What's also happened, and what Kent said is absolutely right, to be in the middle of all this, now you see it's a rarity to find a member of Congress who leaves and who does something other than lobby. So when we get a Lee Hamilton, one of the greats, going out to do other things, it's sort of we all embrace him. Everybody else goes out and does it, and frankly, the staffers who work punishing hours for terrible pay, and it's very difficult to live. Now in an atmosphere, by the way, where we used to have a lot of career people who really prided themselves in doing it, and now they get thrown out or channeled out. But young people come into this process, and frankly, it's like people going into investment banking, saying, I'll do this for 5 years, and then I'll really make it. With them, it's I'll put in my 5 years of dues, and then I can use what I've picked up to go out and make 3 or 4 times as much money. And when they do that, they then have their relationships back with the members, and now every fundraising operation of a member is chaired by a lobbyist, and all of these interrelationships are so deep that people lose sight of the corruption that's built into this process. And most lobbyists still don't want to be shaken down for their own personal money, would prefer not to have that involved, are trying to do what they're supposed to do. But it's all a system that it's careened out of control, to tell you the truth. And I've worked on reforms. I've been skeptical about some reforms in the past. I don't think you can be involved in this process without being sickened by the way it's all playing out. And some of these things are not going to change, no matter how much the pressure for reform comes over us.
So
one sign that this is unprecedented is that Norm has become a radical reformer, which is good, along with the idea that one of the new rules is golf is bad. Is it something else that's come out of this that's good? I want to speak up very briefly, one sentence for lobbyists. They're they perform an important function in our democratic process. The problem is, and Norm's described it very well, is the abuse and the imbalance that's developed. We first of all, have too many lobbyists. There are 35,000 plus registered lobbyists. Many more not registered. How many is that? Imagine Fenway. That's about full of lobbyists. You think that's a terrifying thought. And as Norm indicated, they include a lot of former staffers, 200 or so former members, and the kind of culture and coziness that develops under those circumstances with lots of money is what's wrong. It's not lobbying per se, but it's the change in scale, money, and the structure that has distorted the system in a very serious way. So we have to remember that we can agree that lobbying is a First Amendment right, that political scientists have shown that it's an important function. It's just out of balance, and that has to be corrected, I think, and should be soon.
Just a little truth in advertising here. I'm married to a lobbyist. However, this lobbyist does not have a PAC. At one time, he had a PAC that had $7,000 in it, and so he does public interest work without money, and hopefully pleading a good cause in the right way. And that's part of the discussion I hope we'll have is, one of the first titles that they had for this forum was the fact that ethics in D.C. has collapsed. Well, those of us who live there, who work there, and who know a lot of people who work on the system know that there are a lot of very decent, good, ethical people. But I think that, it comes back to the extent of this particular scandal in these times, which has to come back to the amount of money in campaigns. And I think, ultimately you've got to look at how else are people going to raise this kind of money, and what are you going to do if you have to spend $2, $3, $4 million on a congressional campaign or more? How else are you going to raise it? And the amount of money for the campaigns, some of these people are lining their own pockets, clearly, but a lot of this is for the sake of the campaign and winning, and goes into the campaign committees, money that, many of us don't like the ads, but it's going to ads and not to personal enrichment. So there's another part, I think, of this whole process, which is the amount of money now that it takes to run a modern campaign.
That's absolutely true, Dottie. I ran for the United States Senate in 2002, and I raised $8 million, and I can tell you that I had a lot of lobbyists in Washington, and I was very happy to get their checks because I couldn't run a campaign without that kind of money. So what's the answer? How do we deal with that? Does anybody think McCain-Feingold helped the situation?
Well, I had a hand in crafting it, so I'm biased, but it did help. First of all, we used to have an even more embarrassing open sale of access for money when soft money was the norm. You had, literally menus coming from the parties in Congress going to huge donors saying, for $25,000, you can get lunch with the committee chair of your choice. For $50,000, you can have a private lunch with the speaker, and all of those things. They're now gone. When you had unlimited contributions, donors had no protection of being able to say, I've maxed out, I can't give anymore. And they were basically brought in repeatedly and shaken down for money. So that's gone, and it's turned out that by raising the contribution limits from $1,000 to $2,000, now the parties are raising more money in the hard money and smaller donations than they did in hard and soft combined, and the number of small donors has gone up substantially. It's clearly not enough, and as Dottie suggested, and as you know, and it's true, in this modern society, you can't cut the money off. You need to have resources. But I think we're now seeing a growing number of people who are realizing that we're going to need some public money in this system, and that it's a small investment for the public to make, given the benefits that will accrue in the policy process. We're not at a point yet of a full public financing at the federal level, but I'd like to see tax credits for small contributions, 100% tax credit, and something that even the Committee for Economic Development business leaders have recommended, which is then a 2 or 3 to 1 match for the small contributions. You can make it easier for people to raise money from small donors and give them a real bonus for doing so. You're going to take some of the pressure off. If you did that and ban the leadership PACs, we would be well on the way towards at least a better balance.
I think that might moderate some of this problem, but I think part of it actually relates to the current structure of the government. I was covering the Congress for the Washington Post when Clinton got elected in 1992, and for 2 years you had a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, and there was this pent-up demand in Congress for Democratic legislation that just went zoom, zoom, zoom through, including the Family Leave and Medical Leave Act and different things like that. I think as soon as you had a Republican president to go with a Republican Congress, lacking the break of a Democratic president on Republican aspirations, there was a pent-up demand among the business community for regulatory changes to the government, and so they pumped up the volume to get what they've been wanting to get for a long time. So in a way, that's an advertisement for divided government.
McCain-Feingold did do some good, and I didn't have anything to do with it, Norm. So what I want to resist a little bit, though, and I don't hear it from my fellow panelists so much, but you certainly hear it around here and even in Washington. None of these reforms on the agenda right now in lobbying and some will get at the root of the problem. The root of the problem is money and campaign finance. As a theorist, I should want to go to the root. I believe that probably is one of the roots, and I think we should do something about it. But that almost always is an excuse for not doing something else that's actually doable now. And I don't want us to sort of focus on deep structural problems when actually there's some superficial problems that actually might make a difference. Second point, people have said that this scandal is, well, I'll save my second point for, I don't want to go on too long, but I do think that the kind of reforms that we're talking about in the case of lobbying are probably worth doing, even though they will be circumvented. The Times had a little chart of sort of instructions for people who want to find loopholes and get around any reform that might be proposed. McCain-Feingold had a loophole, 527s. That's not an objection to reform unless you're a utopian reformer who thinks that once and for all we can find a reform and it'll fix things. Reform is sort of like finding antibiotics for viruses. They learn how to get around it, and you have to go back and find a new one. It's a constant struggle. There's a loophole, you close it, there's another reform. That's to be expected. That's the politics of reform. So we shouldn't get discouraged by people saying there are loopholes, and we shouldn't be distracted by the root of the problem either.
Dottie, I think it was you who mentioned earlier that the press had some responsibility in what's gone on. You and Ken ought to be able to speak directly to what could be done in terms of press coverage of what's happening in Washington that it would help with some of these excesses.
Well, on the utopian side, you get into the whole issue of free time and free airtime as a way to compensate. People have been trying, and it's almost gone the other way as far as the press being negligent in their duty or interest in covering television, I'm talking about, in covering campaigns, and not only not giving more time, they're shrinking the amount of time that they give. So that's utopian. I think it's still a very worthwhile cause, goal. It may be something that isn't going to happen that quickly. But a lot of the reforms that have been thrown out are only going to, and in the side of disclosure, which is something that I think is fabulous, and maybe disclosure going into the executive branch as well as the legislative branch, I think is something that is very worthwhile. But that is going to take a huge watchdog operation. Some people feel, a lot of people who don't really want reform say, well, just do disclosure and then overwhelm them with numbers and information, and we'll disclose and they'll never do anything about it. So if you're going to try to do this via disclosure, it has to go hand in hand with watchdog operations, both in terms of public interest groups and the press, to really do something and be able to monitor the disclosure and hold people accountable for this.
Yeah, I mean, in the media, I don't think we've done nearly a good enough job in tracking the money in Washington and the influence that it buys in concrete terms. And one of the reasons we have done much of it is that it's hard and it takes a lot of time. And this is an era where newsrooms are shrinking. Dottie and I both know about that. But we could do better. In fact, there are some of the private organizations like the Center for Public Integrity. They're on the leading edge, and we sort of follow them. They do the data analysis, and we tap into it and develop stories. But we in the media could do a better job, and particularly in an era where computers are as ubiquitous as they are, that we could do a much better job without the kind of manpower it would take back in the days when it was all paperwork.
No, it's interesting with the Abramoff case. There was some very good local reporting on him for many years. He, for a number of years, was with a Seattle-based firm, Preston Gates. And his clients at that point included, among others, the Northern Marianas Islands. And they did some stories it's absolutely scandalous. You have sweatshops there. They're able to get their products, textiles, into the United States, saying "Made in America." They have it's basically almost involuntary servitude. Forced abortions in some cases. If women get pregnant, they don't want them to mess up their schedule, and all kinds of things. And he worked with Tom DeLay and many others to make sure that they could keep that status. And there were stories that were extremely good ones, as in Miami. There were some very good stories in a couple of Florida papers. One of the first indictment of Abramoff came in this bizarre case that involves a purchase he and a partner made of gambling boats in Miami. It's a long and interesting story. Carl Hayson could have written a novel that would have had all of these elements that culminated in the gangland-style slaying of the man, Gus Boulis, from whom they bought the boats. And he was indicted on wire fraud charges, and his partner may be in for worse. But and done by mafia figures who were connected in some ways to them. But there were stories there, but they were ignored by the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. The Post did a few things, and the Post has now picked up on it in the last 6 months with 2 first-rate investigative reporters, and they're doing a great job. The Times did almost nothing. I went back and did a nexus search of all of these things. The K Street Project, not even mentioned in the Times until the last year. It's partly they don't have the resources. It's partly post 9/11, editors not wanting to get into this stuff. It's partly the politicization of the press now, where if you go after a figure who is a part of one side, then the other side's press is going to attack you for bias, which reporters and editors just do not want to see. And it's partly just that they didn't see it as a story. We went past this point where there was a mania about scandal stories in the late 80s and early 90s to the opposite side. And maybe we'll get some pickup here now, but I'm very skeptical that we're going to see a continuing aggressive watchdog role, which should be there whether they're Democrats or Republicans in charge. Because the fact is, this stuff got worse and worse because there was nobody holding the members accountable or watching them. You could have outrages in the ethics process in the House that Speaker Hastert could bring about, knowing that nobody was going to jump up and hold them accountable. So if there were an aggressive press, much of this would have been at least more benign than it turned out to be.
Well, we're going to open this up for questions from the audience, but I have a final question that I want to get in before we do that. The last time we saw this kind of a scandal in 1994 with the congressional check bouncing, the GOP was able to capitalize on that and really take over Congress. What's happening this time? Are we going to see that kind of response in the midterm elections this year? Why haven't the Democrats been able to capitalize more on this scandal, or have they? What's your view?
Yeah, having covered that scandal, I can talk a bit about that. I do agree with Dennis that in relative terms, it wasn't much of a scandal. I felt at the time as a reporter for the Washington Post with this grand job covering Congress, and what I'm writing about is, the balances in members' bank accounts. It didn't strike me as really significant in the bigger scheme of things. Republicans, however, sensed it as an opportunity and were able to use it as a metaphor for larger issues in terms of corruption and mismanagement of Congress, Congress being out of touch. Congress is not like you. They get to bounce checks. You don't have to pay overdraft fees, a whole nexus of things. And in that echo chamber, and it was just beginning then, and we sort of take it for granted now, were the sort of rising conservative talk show hosts. And Rush Limbaugh was one of the echo chambers for that. And it was very effective in flipping control of the House, even though as scandals go, I don't think it was that big. In fact, I was looking at the record, and there's really only one member of the House who was convicted for bouncing checks, and his overdrafts totaled a total of $300,000. It's kind of hard to argue. You sort of didn't have your balance just right when an extra $300,000 was coming your way.
If you go back to that time, it really started with the pay raise in 1988-89, which was a deal concocted by Ronald Reagan, George Herbert Walker Bush, Newt Gingrich went along, the Democrats and Republicans in Congress, but it caused an enormous backlash in the public. That was what got Rush Limbaugh launched in his career. And I remember going down to the Democrats at that point the House Democrats had a retreat at the Greenbrier Resort, and they took a train down, and I go down to the party retreats. Going to get on the train at Union Station, you had to run the gauntlet of angry protesters. And on the train itself, Speaker Jim Wright, who was in deep trouble otherwise at that point, the members were just absolutely furious with him. The tension was enormous. We went from there on through a series of other scandals, Wright being forced out of office. In 93, Dan Rostenkowski, who was really the symbol of power in Washington, was indicted and had to leave the chairmanship. And then the House Bank, the post office, and all of those things combined, but it was a perfect storm. And the House Bank involved Democrats and Republicans, but the Democrats were in charge. They had been for 40 years, and it was a symbol of neglect in management and an attitude that we're in charge and we can do anything we want. But that combined as well with a public dissatisfaction with the way things were going in the country and a feeling that not only were they corrupt, but they weren't doing the things that they were supposed to do for the American people. And that led to the firestorm. Now here you've had Tom DeLay resign. You have a scandal that involves Democrats and Republicans with Abramoff and the money, but the Republicans are clearly in charge, and there's unhappiness with the way things are going. The ingredients are there for a perfect storm, although the way the districts have changed, a perfect storm now, that was 52 seats in the House, now it might be 20. But it all has to come together in October. And we don't know if it'll all come together in October.
One of the problems that the Democrats have, I think, is this perception that everybody does it. Yeah. So that the Democrats are trying to say it's a Republican scandal. In the CBS News New York Times poll last week, 77% of people said everybody does it. A few more said it was Republican than Democratic, but overall, people think everybody's done it. So the Democrats are trying to turn it from the corruption into one-party government to see if they can, and then link it to issues that really affect people and try to make a couple of connections there that they're trying to go from corruption to Medicare prescription drug problems, other kinds of issues that really are going to resonate more with voters. But that 77% is a very hard nut to crack, to say that Democrats are somehow so pure that you should just hand over the government to them when voters are very suspicious of all politicians.
Yeah, and I think, in fact, though the public is wrong about this particular scandal, it isn't both parties. It's Republican. They're not wrong about the general problem, which is irresponsibility, basically, on the part of both Democrats and Republicans in the House and Senate over a fairly long period of time, not taking seriously the possibility that the ethics process is really badly designed and not working at all. And so as long as we as citizens look at Congress as one of the few places, the press being the other, which insists that only they can judge whether what they're doing is right, that nobody from the outside has anything to say about it, and don't think, because voters, I can only vote for my own representatives, I can't say anything about Tom DeLay. That as long as there is that suspicion, which I think is well-founded, that people shouldn't be judges in their own cause, which is essentially the ethics process in Congress, there's going to continue to be deep distrust of both parties and of the institution. So while public opinion is wrong about this scandal, it's not wrong about the broader question of who's responsible. They're both responsible for that particular neglect.
There's one other interesting dynamic here. back in '93, I spent a lot of time importuning Speaker Tom Foley and Majority Leader Dick Gephardt to deal with what was clearly going to be a train wreck down the road, which was the problem of Congress passing laws that put mandates onto others but exempting themselves. It was something everybody could understand. An insular group of people who were not only giving themselves a pay raise, but forcing small businesses and others to do all kinds of things, and then they didn't have to do them themselves. And there was a genuine issue here. It's a separation of powers issue. You can't have an executive branch agency with regulatory authority over a Congress. So I went to them and said, look, we can deal with this. You can create an office inside Congress with some independence, and then you can examine each of the different elements and see what laws should apply and shouldn't apply. And the attitude was, yeah, that's fine, but who cares? It's not really a big deal. They were really oblivious to the notion that all of this would come together. And in the end, at the 11th hour, they tried to pass something in the House and failed, and it became a part of the contract. Now, you have Republicans immediately starting out saying we got to get ahead of the curve on reform. Now they're retrenching a little bit, and I think are hoping that this will blow over so they don't have to make substantial changes in their own lives, including in the ethics process and the way they deal with lobbyists, the way they raise money, and all the rest of it. And if they let Democrats be out there as the party of reform, and with just a few exceptions, end up being a party that says we don't want to overreact here, they could create a big problem. If they get out ahead of this and actually force some bipartisan compromise, because Democrats, frankly, don't want it to be bipartisan at this point, because it would dilute the issue, then they may be able to mitigate the problem at least a little bit.
Okay, well, I have a quick follow-up, and that is, do you think the choice of Boehner to replace DeLay is a sign that they're actually going to go forward with reform, or is that a retrenchment?
No, it's a retrenchment. It's really interesting that when Boehner first announced his leadership, a candidacy for leadership, he said, you want a reformer? I'm the original reformer. I was a part of what they called the Gang of Seven, a group of people who in 1994 used guerrilla tactics. One of them, Jim Nussle of Iowa, went onto the floor with a paper bag over his head to say he was ashamed to be a member of Congress. And they did all kinds of things. They seized on the House bank, as Ken knows very well, and pushed for reform. And he said, I'll give it to you. Then got pushback from the members. Because Speaker Hastert, first thing he said was, we'll ban all privately funded travel. And they said, no, we don't want to do that. And now Boehner is basically saying, well, we don't want to overreact here. But the choice of Boehner was really an expression that they knew they had to make some kind of a change to show that it wasn't the same old Tom DeLay team. But they didn't want to go too far and pick somebody who would eliminate all the earmarks and do the kinds of things that would really discomfort them. They have a point. You can overreact. You can do things that are counterproductive or don't work. We don't want to end travel by members of Congress. It's good that they travel. There is good travel. There is corrupting travel. And you can make a distinction. Earmarks per se are not awful things. The explosion of them and the idea that now they're crowding out there's academic earmarking as there is roads and other kinds of pork things. You can find a balance there where you build in accountability. But this, was a sign by the Republican membership that they wanted some insulation against discomforting change, and that may be a problem for them.
Okay, let's go to questions from the audience. We have microphones here and here on the floor, on the balcony, on that side and that side, and I'll just ask if you would introduce yourselves. And you can ask more than one question, but we're only going to respond to one question. So, yes, sir.
My name is Herman Soot. I'm at the medical school. I would like to comment just before the question that I have been really rather amazed to be here and have the lobbyists portrayed as the victims, the good guys doing a necessary job. And all the problems, at least as presented tonight, have come from members of Congress. And my perception has been quite the opposite. My perception has been that lobbyists are out buying pieces of legislation, like they go to the supermarket. They buy what they want. And I would like to ask if any of you would comment on what to me is the most egregious example of corruption, I assume bought by lobbyists, in that the Congress has passed and the President has signed legislation which makes it illegal for the United States government to negotiate for lower prices on drugs. And we're told all the time that we have a huge problem with the cost of health care in this system, but our health care cost is significantly affected by the way in which it's illegal to negotiate for those prices. It's illegal for the United States citizen to buy drugs abroad, but we can buy automobiles, we can buy almost anything else. But those lobbyists have purchased a very good deal for themselves. And there's no question that they're making huge amounts of money. And so if this isn't a sign of lobbyists, I would like to be educated a little bit more in detail.
Well, I think what Norm was saying is that, members are not solely victims, and that you can see lobbyists as victimizers. You can also see members as victimizers. I mean, the lobbyists couldn't be buying that legislation if there wasn't a ready market in these members of Congress for the cash that they're giving them with the other hand. So it's sort of like there's a mutual system where both can be faulted quite correctly for what the results are.
With the Medicare prescription drug bill, which is a classic example of bad process bringing bad policy, this was not simply pharmaceutical companies coming in and saying, oh, let's do this. First, they didn't want a bill in the first place. But as much as anything, this was Republicans in the House who decided they want to write a bill by Republicans in the House, shutting others out. And this reflected ideology as much as anything else. They didn't want the government negotiating, which the government does do, by the way, in the veterans process and does very successfully. They wanted competition. The price for getting a Medicare prescription drug bill, which they viewed as a necessity to avoid an enormous backlash by seniors once the issue was out there, with their own members in many cases, was building in all these different areas of competition, health savings accounts and turning it over to the private sector. The money from pharmaceuticals was certainly a part of it, but it wasn't the only element to this.
But it resulted in a very bad outcome.
Yes. Not a good bill.
Since I said something in favor of lobbyists, I want to correct the record for my colleagues. It's true that not all lobbyists are bad, but not all lobbyists are good. I suspect not all bad legislation is the result of lobbyists, and I suspect the people in Washington know better that this particular piece of bad legislation the cause is multiple, it's overdetermined. But lobbyists, I think, for example, it is perfectly legal and fairly common for lobbyists to operate with contingency fees. That is, we'll pay you, the client pays the lobbyist, only if he gets the legislation. That's extraordinary. You can't do that for government contracts, but for general legislation, that hasn't been mentioned as one of the reforms. And that's troubling. The second thing about lobbyists is not just that they buy a piece of legislation, it's that they have access in a regular way, maybe at St. Andrews, but campaign fundraisers, the rest of us or other business interests don't have, who are not willing to pay to play the game. So I wouldn't concentrate just on whether some lobbyist buys a piece of legislation. I would try to look at the whole system of unequal access based on how much money you have.
Of course, a lobbyist has a client, and the lobbyist is the actor on behalf of a client. So whether it's a corporation or organization or whatever else, the lobbyist is the agent there, but it's the corporation who is the ultimate benefactor of a lot of this legislation.
Well, yeah, Abramoff worked on both of
exactly.
his. He wasn't even honest with his clients.
But we do assume, don't we, that members of Congress can refuse to do what lobbyists are asking them to do. I mean, when I was governor, I got lobbied by a lot of people, and I didn't do everything that all of the lobbyists asked me to do. So, I don't think we should assume that lobbyists in and of themselves are bad, but we've got a system here that's out of control, that, as people have discussed.
And, it's interesting when we worked through McCain-Feingold, the opponents of the campaign reform legislation said, and Mitch McConnell got on the floor of the Senate and said, every dime that corporations are giving in soft money will be given, and even more, they'll just channel it to other organizations. And it's turned out not to be the case. You don't have companies sitting there saying, we got all this money to burn, let's throw it into politics. In fact, for the most part, they'd be delighted if you could remove the money from the process. They've got all kinds of ways to get access. As it is, it becomes the ticket for admission. And it's a ticket where the price tag is basically set not by them, but by the members of Congress, who often, by the way, use the legislative process to get one big set of interests pitted against another. We kept the telecommunications process going, as Bob Graham knows very well, for a long time, so that you could get each side bidding the amounts up. So it's more complicated than it appears on the surface.
Yes, sir.
George Theodosiou, HILR. The title of the panel discussion is Has Ethics Collapsed in D.C.? I would like to ask, has ethics ever existed in D.C.? And I would like all the members of the panel, including the moderator, to give a short definition of ethics.
Anybody want to take that first? Our ethics professor.
As the moderator indicated in the introduction, I wrote a book called Ethics in Congress. And you can immediately, I didn't know so many people knew the word oxymoron. The taxi driver in Washington saw that. Said, that's an oxymoron. I didn't know people said, it must be a short book. I actually resist the idea, the cynicism behind that, because I think, first of all, that we do have certain standards and we can judge what good behavior is in Congress. And the fact that members themselves and some people in Washington are still able to criticize what goes on in Congress suggests that there are sets of norms of what good
That's
behavior
called
is.
opportunism.
That's what?
That is called opportunism.
Why do you think so?
Anybody that criticizes someone...
Excuse me?
Go ahead.
No, I ask you, why do you think so? Because there is a kind of perfectly understandable reductionist view that anything any of us says is kind of self-interested. The whole panel here is actually trying to make themselves look ethical by criticizing Congress. And that's where I'm afraid you're going. If there's nobody in Washington or in Congress who has a sense of what the right principles are, which let us say that congressional ethics is acting according to principles that serve the democratic process in a way that we would all respect.
I would
That's
like to
congressional
hear the answers from the other members. I do have a comment on it.
Definitionally, if I yield to the professor, I'll just tell you in very practical terms, as I started, to say that those of us who've lived in Washington, either as journalists or as politicians or as lobbyists, many are good, honest people of great integrity and great concern for the public interest. There was a funeral recently for a reporter for the New York Times named David Rosenbaum. 700 people packed a room in the Dirksen building and heard speaker after speaker, from David Pryor to the journalist's son talk about this man as a family man, a hard worker, a seeker of truth, and the room was filled with his sources who were staff members on congressional committees, other journalists, people who have worked their entire lives to make this country better, and in a city where there are institutions that are designed to help the country and help the society, who feel so strongly about that. And I think that's why the scandal has been so upsetting. And you go to a service like that and you see people that have been working the system in a very unassuming way for many years of great integrity and great commitment to the public service. And there is I think, a renewed commitment on the part of many to get rid of these bad actors and this bad process. And that's what, I'm hopeful that this terrible period we've gone through with this scandal can yield to something good.
I too would say that I don't agree that everybody in Washington is unethical. I agree with Dottie that there are many fine, honest people there, and I think it's a mistake for journalists to go around operating on the assumption that public officials and the people who work for them are all dishonest, because it's not true and it's not fair.
Well, as I said, I've been there for 36 years, but I also get around. And I think it is always the case when you have immense amounts of money and power together in one stew that there are going to be people who go to the dark side. That's true whether you're in Washington or in Cleveland or in Peoria, and whether you're working in a law firm or a physician or in a business or in a newsroom, to tell you the truth. And most of the members of Congress, and I've known a whole lot over 36 years, because I've been kind of immersed in the process, and I know the vast majority of them in both parties, are very decent, honorable people who are there mostly because they want to do the right thing. There are fewer now. I see more coming, using it as a springboard to something else. I'm deeply disturbed because the number of people who care about their own institution is declined dramatically and rapidly. And this Congress especially, I find it as troubling as anything else, is that they don't have any sense of themselves as an independent institution anymore. Watching as things play out on the wiretapping case and many other areas, the lack of oversight of the 9/11 process, of the Department of Homeland Security, we could go on and on. That troubles me. Most are not there to get rich quick, and they don't get rich quick. And people who stay there for a couple of decades are not making big bucks, to say the least. When I look at friends who are judges, they're making less than the first-year associates in law firms, and they'll do it for 20 or 30 years. And they're not bad people. I spent a large part of my life in an academic setting, and I don't think we want to get into the question of ethics in an academic setting as opposed to ethics in Washington, or nobody will be happy.
You left that out of your earlier
yes.
list.
I was going to build towards that. Now, what do you mean by ethics? Well, first of all, there is no ideal here. There is no public policy that meets the test of the public interest. It is always a balancing act. And always a lot of different interests convene and have to be put into different contexts. But this is, what makes this different is that it's not just a few bad apples or those who have been turned to the dark side because they were seduced by money, power, or the other things associated with it. It's that people at the top decided to build in a kind of systemic, corrupt process. That is different from what we've had before.
Governor?
For me, ethics means trying to do what's right, be law-abiding, go by the rules, live by my principles. And I share what everybody else here has said, that most of the people that I have met in the public service and government are people who are trying to do what's right. And, I also believe that democracy works and that our government is a reflection of the people in the country. And when I was a college student, it was during the Vietnam War, and I remember getting very frustrated by the failure of our government to respond to people demonstrating against the war and the public opinion against the war, and having a conversation with one of my political science professors saying, what's wrong? Why doesn't this country work? And he said to me, just wait. When enough people get concerned enough about the policies of this country, then the policies will change and the government will change. And he was right about that. And I believe that democracy isn't working quite the way I want it to right now, given the scandals in Washington, but that people are going to get upset enough that that's going to change.
I'm shocked by the fact that none of you were able to provide a definition for ethics.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Sunny Gettinger. I'm a second-year student at Kennedy School. I recently saw a Pew Center poll that about 14% of the American public was following this case in any way. So my question is this actually going to be a factor in the 2006 election? And if so, how is it going to get to that level of engaging the public imagination, as you just brought up?
It depends on the effectiveness of the political communication by the opposition minority party at the moment, quite frankly. They'll have to get over their previous failures to communicate to the public. That's what the Republicans did in 1994. They took it, they wrapped it up, they metaphorized it, and they repeated it over and over and over again until people did hear it.
And it'll also depend on indictments. Indictments of lobbyists who most people have never heard of before won't make a scandal that 80% of Americans pay any attention to. Prominent members of Congress get indicted, and then you're going to see a different level of interest develop, I think. And if somebody got lost on a mine shaft or in a well, that would make a difference.
Well, and you do
really get attention.
You do get different answers depending. I mean, if you ask about this scandal, you get lower levels of interest. But if you ask what is corruption an important issue, it's risen considerably. It's much higher in the list of things that are going to count. People don't know exactly what it is, and maybe they think both parties are to blame. But there is now, and probably will continue into the election cycle, more weight on corruption as an issue. That's encouraging or not, depending on what
Well, I think I said this before, but I think the next step of how this has had an impact on people's lives, not just that it's corruption because people are very cynical about that, but has to be taken the next step. And I think there are a lot of Democratic minds working very hard on trying to show that linkage. And when voters, to create the kind of wave that the Democrats need to be able to really take back the Congress and the House is really what we're talking about here. It's going to take, I think, a bigger moment than just Jack Abramoff. It's going to take that linkage to be made that people's own lives have been affected badly, and their feelings about the country will have altered in order to get that big wave going.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm Sean Carberry, a student here, and I want to pick up actually a little bit on the previous question. Polling also shows that people have a pretty dim view of Congress at this point. You alluded to the fact that people conflate both parties with what's going on. So Congress is also not an institution known for reforming itself without a lot of outside pressure. So if there's no electoral sword of Damocles hanging over Congress, are reforms going to happen? And given the fact that there is such cynicism in the electorate about Congress in particular, is it realistic to think that regardless of whether the Democrats get some big slogan together, there is going to be some mounting pressure and we're going to see some reforms, or is this going to be more of a speed bump?
Well, it's going to take certainly a widening of the scandal and a sense which Republicans have had for a while, which has died down a little bit because the scandal stuff has ebbed in terms of its news, of panic. A belief that if they don't do something, then they could suffer the fate the Democrats suffered in 1994. If you don't have that, then the pressure to act in any significant way will be lessened, and then it'll be, as Dottie said, on the Democrats to try and make themselves the party of reform. Part of the problem here is that a lot of Democrats don't want to change some of the fundamental elements of the system either. Getting rid of leadership PACs, which I think would be a really significant step here, isn't going to happen in the short run because both parties operate with them and use them very effectively. Getting changes in the ethics process, which Dennis and I both tried to do, has been very difficult to do. What's required is to get some outside presence. Neither party is comfortable with that at this point. But we're starting to see more members, serious members, opinion leaders, begin to focus on this and understand the need for doing it. And we're going to see bills and resolutions introduced with concrete changes coming from prominent figures. Then, if the moment arises, it will be an opportunity to make it work. But there are ifs here to make anything beyond window dressing basically occur. And of course, one of the real problems is, as they've discovered, if you, for example, ban lobbyists from buying lunches or dinners for members, which is, not as big a problem as many people think it is. But if you do that, unless you change the campaign finance reform laws or even ban private travel, you can still, as long as you give somebody a check for his campaign, take him to dinner and pay whatever you want, or take him in a plane anywhere you want to take him for a fundraising event. So you got to take it to the next level, or you'll end up with not just loopholes, but things that are much worse than that.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Conlisk in the mid-career program here at the Kennedy School. Last semester, the Washington bureau chief of the New York Times was here and kind of bemoaned the investigation of the journalists. And I was wondering, I understand that the Abramoff investigation is ongoing and it's continuing and it will spread. Do you think that there's any sense on the part of journalists that there's any fear on their part that if they kind of take a parallel path with this investigation on their own, that it might turn back on them? Will it have any kind of spillover effect? Or is that completely just not even possible?
Well, there's not a national security aspect to this one, so.
I understand, but the leaks, any kind of leak in this ongoing investigation.
No, I think everybody's dying to get the next scoop on this one. I mean, this is
already down the road.
This is a great story that people have really started to dig on, and I think the Washington Post has, in many ways, embarrassed the New York Times on this story, and there are a lot of people who are digging. But the worry is that this passes, and then we go back to whatever the next flavor of the month is. So I don't think there's any fear on this that somebody's going to go to jail because somebody told them something. It's more a question of when does it peter out of getting the great stuff into the nitty-gritty of this congressman. I mean, I know it from a television point of view. Congressman Ney from Ohio, there's a lot of information available there, but we had a hard time selling our bosses on putting it on television because it's whoever heard of Congressman Ney. Give me a name.
I'm from Ohio.
But, give me a name that I know. It got to be so big that eventually we did the story. But I think that's the concern, that will just look too minute and not so blockbustery is when you have a name like Tom DeLay, and that's the Republicans' hope that when they changed from DeLay to Boehner, the interest in the story in a big way would wane.
I hope you're not from the 8th District of Ohio, too. No, that's Boehner's district, and that's where I grew up, and I can testify. I was there through high school. I never once saw a reformer.
Good evening. I'm Jim Montgomery, also in the mid-career program here. Wondered, in your opinion, given the increasing nature of one-party dominance in individual congressional districts after the last redistricting process, how realistic is a change in party as a result of all these scandals?
It's an uphill battle in the House. There are basically about 35 seriously competitive seats in the House. What we saw in 1994, though, is that we had 3 times as many competitive seats. But even some of the seats we wouldn't have seen as competitive turned over when you've got a tsunami out there in the electorate. But it really is the case that this time it's hard to imagine more than 20 seats, even in a dramatic change going over. And I must tell you, I say to my Democratic friends in the House, here are two scenarios for you. You pick up 13 seats and leave the Republicans in charge with a majority of 2. Or you pick up 17 seats and you're in charge with a majority of 2. Which would you prefer? And if you pick the latter, you get an F in Politics 101. Because if they take a majority, it's going to be with a slender number. They'll have a responsibility for governing and no ability to do anything. And at this point, frankly, no program in which to operate anyhow. But it's basically in that range. Redistricting remains a huge problem in the process. And March 1st, the Supreme Court is hearing the Texas case. They took it up on an expedited basis and have it set for 2 hours of oral argument, twice as much as usual, in a very unusual afternoon session. Let's just hope and pray that that's a sign that they really want to do something, and they're doing it on an expedited basis because they've already signaled to the parties here that if they do, in fact, make a change, they want to have it apply to the 2006 elections. If they did that, that alone would free up 6 or 7 races that are now not particularly significant ones, put them in play, Republican seats, and could make a real difference, too.
Final question.
Hi, my name is Marcy Murninghan. I have a doctorate from the Ed School and know about oxymorons because I taught courses on money and morality at the Divinity School for several years here. So my question is on another actor that has been alluded to but not really addressed in terms of the larger sort of picture of corruption and the various institutional actors that are in play. Last year, there were 42 shareholder resolutions filed to corporations to ask them to disclose their political contributions, most of which were unsuccessful in terms of actual greater levels of corporate disclosure, but it does represent one aspect of where there are opportunities for change. That is to say, shareholders who are in a position as owners to seek more disclosure and accountability from major companies, which in turn, as we know, are key players in how policy is made in Washington. What comments do you have in terms of that angle, in terms of the money trail? Will increased disclosure on the part of companies make a difference or not? Is that an area that's worth pursuing or not?
What do you think?
Well, I'm actually not familiar with this particular effort. They want companies to disclose what money that they gave who? Because it's against the law for corporations to give campaign contributions now. That's against the law since Nixon era. So what is the money
level, the extent to which they are providing monies on various policy fronts to lobbyists and other groups that are in the position of influencing congressmen and people?
Certainly, when getting rid of soft money contributions were not in annual reports, and now that's gone. But there are substantial sums of money used in grassroots campaigns, in issue advocacy campaigns, and going to lobbyists. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to push for companies to disclose what they're spending on their efforts in Washington. It's also, as we move towards greater disclosure of lobbying contacts in Washington, it should come back to the clients. And that becomes particularly important, I think, in journalists being able to work their way through this web and figure out what's happening.
I'm sure journalists would love to have that information.
But it does suggest putting together several questions here, actually, that this isn't only a problem about lobbyists and about members in Washington. It's not even only a problem about the press. That if we're going to do something here, it involves people in the medical community, our colleague from the medical school, and the corporations and reform there. And I was struck, two of the questioners from the Kennedy School students here were more distant than I think Kennedy School students usually are, they too have a responsibility, after all. They can't sit back and say, what's Congress going to do about this, or what kind of reform? If we're going to take advantage of this opportunity that's been thrown up to us, you never have ethics reform unless you have ethics scandals, and people who concentrate on ethics like me would be out of business if we got rid of it all. This is an opportunity, and I do think, to answer your specific question, that would make a difference, and some of the proposals actually would help movements like that.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the panelists again. It's been a great discussion.